Hey, first grade, we are going to do a virtual language dive together today. And remember that language dives are used in our classroom to help us look at a sentence and figure out chunk by chunk what the sentence is telling us and discuss different clues in the sentence and different words that give us more information about things like the subject or the reason for a specific word, things like that. So our sentence today is going to come from Maggie, the one-eyed peregrine falcon. And we're going to take it, like I said, chunk by chunk, and we're going to talk about what the sentence is telling us and any words within that sentence that give us an extra clue. So our target today is I can participate in a virtual language dive. So here is our sentence. I'm going to read the whole sentence to you, and then we're going to take it chunk by chunk. So this sentence came straight out of our story, and it says, if they remove it, Maggie can never return to the wild. If they remove it, Maggie can never return to the wild. Okay, so that's our sentence. Now let's talk about it chunk by chunk. So this chunk says, if they remove it. So when we're looking at this chunk, I want to know who is they. So think back to our story. If they remove it, who is doing the removing, or who is they that would be in charge of removing her eye? So take a couple seconds and think about it. Come up with an answer. Who is they? And we know from our story that they is the doctors, are the doctors. So if the doctors remove it, we're using the word they in place of the doctors. What about this word if? Can you figure out why the author used if? So think just for a couple seconds. If they remove it, why did the author choose to write if? We use the word if when we talk about something that might happen. So it signals that next we will learn about what removing the eye will cause to happen. So specifically to Maggie, if they remove the eye, we're going to talk about what happens if they do remove it. So if is used to signal something that might happen. Okay, so if they remove it, if signals what might happen, they is the doctors. The doctors are going to be the ones to remove it. Let's take a look at our next chunk. So if they remove it, Maggie can never return. If they remove it, Maggie can never return. So let's go back to the word if. Remember, if signals that something might happen, right? We don't know for sure, but if they remove it, Maggie can never return. So this is the consequence if they remove the eye. So this is what we were waiting to understand. If they remove it, this might happen, that Maggie can never return. Can never suggests that it will be impossible for Maggie to go back to the nest where she lived. Remember that peregrine falcons need both of their eyes to hunt, and if they remove her eye, Maggie can't go back to the wild because she'll be unable to hunt. And we talked a couple months ago about how one of the things that birds need to survive is food. If Maggie can't hunt because her eye has been removed, then she can't feed herself and she won't survive. So the consequence of removing the eye is that Maggie can never return. All right, our last chunk is to the wild. If they remove it, Maggie can never return to the wild. So let's talk about some of the words here. So where won't Maggie be able to return? Think about that for just a second. Where specifically won't Maggie be able to return? So this sentence tells us the wild, right? She will not be able to return to the wild if they remove her eye. And when we are talking about the word wild, we're talking about her parents' nest, right? Being back in the city, somewhere outside of the educational center where she has to fend for herself and do her own hunting. So let's put it all back together and read this sentence again. If they remove it, Maggie can never return to the wild. So just to go back and review some of those words, we talked about the word if and how the author used that to signal something that might happen. We talked about what the word they meant in this sentence. They is talking about the doctors who are in charge of doing her surgery. We talked about the consequence of removing her eye, that if they do remove her eye, she can never return. And specifically, she can never return to the wild, because we talked about how peregrine falcons need both of their eyes to hunt. And if her eye is removed, she can't return to the wild, to her parents' nest, because she'll be unable to hunt by herself. All right, first grade, your job is to write this sentence in Dojo. You can send it to me as a text file. You can write it on a piece of paper and take a picture. I'm going to read it one more time, and then I want you to write it and send it to me. If they remove it, Maggie can never return to the wild. Okay, so write that down, send it to me in Dojo, and I'll give you some feedback.